In this lesson, we talk about inheritance makes it easy to reuse code. The objectives for this lesson are to learn how to use inheritance, learn to override methods, talk about the difference between implementation and interface inheritance, and we're going to see many examples of inheritance. Inheritance is when classes can reuse all the properties and methods of another class. What happens is the new class can add additional properties and methods while still using the original class's properties and methods. Now, it's possible to override the methods in the original class from the new class as well. So why do we use inheritance? Well, as you can imagine, if you're able to reuse things from another class, this avoids a lot of duplicate code. Also, what's really nice is when you change the base class, all the inherited classes get the same change, which is a big advantage. When designing your classes for inheritance, remember it's an is-a relationship. What do I mean by that? Well, an employee is a person. So if you have a person class, an employee can inherit from that because an employee is a person, just as a manager is a person. But a leg is not a person. So always keep that in mind, that when the person is a base class, employee is a person, manager is a person, but leg is not a person. So be thinking about kind of that real world entity that you're modeling and decide whether it has that is a relationship. Now, the terminology that we use within inheritance is that new class that's created by inheritance is called a child class or a subclass or a derived class. You'll hear it all sorts of different ways. And the original class itself can be called the parent class, the superclass, the base class. You will hear all of these different terms when you're working with inheritance. Let's dive into some demonstrations by creating a person class. Right mouse click on the project, add a class, and give it the name person. I'm going to go ahead and just wipe everything out and put in this class that I have pre-created. We do the same thing. We create it under a namespace. I then public class person, and then we give it however many properties. What describes a person? Well, obviously we have a first name, a last name, and an age. So I'm going to just keep it simple at this point. But then let's go ahead and use this by instantiating a new instance of a person class and assigning some property values. So first name is equal to John, last name is equal to Smith, age is equal to 22, and then we can just simply emit on the console the last name, comma, the first name. So if we run this, we see Smith, comma, John. Now that we have the person class, let's create an employee class that inherits from that person. Right mouse click on the project and let's add another class called employee. And what we're going to do now, as you can see on line 3, public class employee colon person. When you add that colon, it means you're inheriting from something. And then I've added a couple of additional properties here, an employee ID and a salary. Now that means that employee, since it is a person, it gets the first name and last name and the age, but it also then adds on these additional ones. So what we can do now is when we create an instance of employee here on line 3, we can still fill in the first name, the last name, and the age, and we can now also additionally set the employee ID and the salary. And then, of course, we can display all of those on the console. So the great thing here is that we have been able to use all of the code already written in person and just add additional things onto the employee class. Obviously, we can have methods in both employee and person, but we're also allowed to add on functionality to an original method that's in your base class. So if the employee class wants to override some functionality in that original method, it can do that. It can even totally replace the functionality of the original method as well. Let's take a look at overriding the ToString method. Now, every object has a ToString method. By default, what it will report back, let's go ahead and comment these two out here. What it'll come back with is the namespace dot the class name. But we can override that. If we go into the person class here and we type in override ToString and hit tab, it gives us back how you can override this. So I'm going to go ahead and put in last name, comma, first name. So now back here on the program.cs, when we run this, it gives me back last name, comma, first name. We can also override then the employee class. So when we come in here to the ToString on the employee class, we can override it. But look what I'm doing on line 8. I'm actually saying, let's go call the base class's ToString method. The base class is person. So it grabs that last name, comma, first name, brings it back into this string called RET. We then do RET, environment.newline, and then employee ID dash salary as a currency. So now, when we run this, since this is an employee, let's set a breakpoint. So now when we walk through this, look what happens. It's going to go down into the ToString on the person class, returns that value, takes that value and then concatenates it all together and returns that. And then what we're going to see here is that. There we go. Smith, comma, John, and then 1-100,000. So overriding methods is a great technique. Again, it allows us to kind of add what's already there, but then build on new functionality as well. Now, we just overrided one of the .NET Framework's built-in methods on the object class. Let's now take a look at overriding your own method. In the person class, add your own method called getInfo and define it as a public virtual string. By adding this keyword virtual, it means that you're allowed, or any class that inherits from this is allowed, to override this method. And they can do the same thing. They can do the base.getInfo and call this one, or they just completely replace it. Now what I'm doing on the getInfo is I'm returning last name, comma, first name, but then I'm adding on the age as well. So again, if we go to the program.cs here, and let's change this to call getInfo now. Now we get Smith, comma, John, age equals 22. Now let's go to the employee class and let's override our own method that we just created by, again, doing public override string getInfo. So the signature has to be the same. The only difference is that you're using the override keyword to say, hey, I know you're a virtual method. I'm replacing your functionality. And what we're replacing it with is return employee ID, and we grab the employee ID, and then look at that. We actually call base.getInfo. So we're still getting the last name, the first name, and the age, and then we're adding on the salary after that. So if we now run this, we now get employee ID 1, Smith, comma, John, age equals 22, salary equals 100,000. Let's take a look at one more example, and that's building a customer class. Once again, right mouse click on the project, add a class, type in customer, and now what we're doing is we're creating public class customer that inherits from person. So again, I had the employee inheriting from person. I now have a customer inheriting from person because both of those have that is a relationship to person. On the customer class, I'm creating a customer ID, a company name, and an email address properties. I'm overriding the getInfo method so that I now report the customer ID. And then we also then have the override of the ToString, which simply returns the getInfo. So I didn't want to do anything different on the ToString. I said, you know what, let's just reuse that same information that I have in that method. If we now then go over to our program.cs here, and we create a new customer, we add in a customer ID, an email address, and we call the getInfo, we get all the customer information now. In this lesson, we learned to inherit from a base class, and we learned to override methods. Now, there's additional inheritance concepts And that's what's coming up next.